Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Taken 3. Long before Hollywood kind of gave a shit about sequels, they would just kind of hire an assistant director or an editor to make the sequel or the second sequel or so forth. And most of the time, you could really tell that they got a first-time director who didn't really know what they were doing, and the producer could have cared less and was just really a cash-in. Most of the time, the studios just didn't really care about making good sequels. They just wanted to make a cash-in. There were exceptions to this, but I'm talking about generally here. The Taken films are the last remnants of those kind of sequels. I can't think of a franchise that are more interested in the cash-in than actually making an interesting sequel. And this Taken trilogy, as we're calling it, reeks of that. It's trying to act like it's a finale to something, even though the whole thing ended with the first one, so it's like saying it ends here. It makes no sense with the story that goes on in the movie. It's not like The Hobbit, where there's like a conclusion. I mean, there's a conclusion to the story, but it's not like a conclusion that's been building for films. It's just one of the most ineptly made, terrible sequels that used to kind of come out of Hollywood through the sequel system, but for some reason Taken 3 managed to keep old kind of 70s, 80s Hollywood sequels keep going with these terrible action films. The Brian Mills character, and in this film his wife Famke Janssen, is found killed in his apartment as she tells him they're going to meet in his apartment. He goes to get bagels, comes back and finds her throat slit, and she is in his bed, and then cops come to arrest him, and he is on the run, framed for her murder, as he tries to figure out who did this and to protect his daughter. And in this film, they're in the amazing location of Los Angeles, where no movies are made or take place. So it's a lot less exotic and a lot less thrilling because no one's taken except for our hearts. And instead you see the Brian Mills character try to fight his way through another adventure where nothing gets taken. This is directed by Olivier or Oliver Megaton, which is not his real last name. He decided to name himself after the Hiroshima bomb because he is very tactless, much like his action direction. If you get a good action director and an action sequence happens, you need geography and you need good cinematography and tactful editing with timing. And Taken 3 has none of that. In fact, I think Taken 3 is close but not as horrible as the fourth Die Hard movie. No, wait, the fifth Die Hard movie. God, they made a lot of this, which had pretty terrible editing and is still my number one for worst movie I've seen in the last 5 years, definitely. But Taken 3 kind of takes that on in not really understanding how to shoot or edit an action sequence. There's always a lot of images going around. It looks crazy and all these things are going on. The idea to have this shaky cam and all this editing theoretically is that, you know, when you're running and all this crazy stuff is happening, that you can't really take in everything, and there's a whole psychological aspect to that. I'm really giving the filmmaker a lot more credit because I don't think they really understand what they're doing with that. And really pretty much all the time when people do that shaky cam quick editing thing, it just looks like somebody threw up and somehow they cut it together and they're calling it an action sequence. Every action sequence is like that. There are a couple where I was like, if this was shot correctly, it looked like it was staged correctly, but if this was shot and choreographed and storyboarded correctly, you'd have an incredible sequence. Unfortunately, it was directed by someone as ineptly terrible at making action sequences and action movies as Oliver Megaton. There's this one sequence where there's a car chase and this big truck flips over a couple times, and just the way they cut it together was so horrible. It just looked like I was getting hit with images. And then at the end of the sequence, Liam Neeson says like a cool one-liner, and it's kind of supposed to be the levity after the action sequence, where you all laugh. You're like, oh, that was intense, but Liam Neeson said a joke. I feel calmer now. And it really was just more like, oh, that was over, that weird experimental bizarre thing you call an action sequence. They were just all terrible. There are all these close-ups, which close-ups are really like an exclamation point. And if this film was like a tweet, it would be someone just hitting exclamation points 140 times. Taken 3 is so horribly directed. And if you thought Taken 2 was bad, whoa boy, Taken 3 just knocks that one right out of the park in terms of terribleness. It doesn't really make a lot of sense as a sequel, and you kind of often wonder why they tried to mix it up, but not really mix it up. Hey, we mixed up the idea, but we have the same director as the second one. Europa Corp are famous for their modestly budgeted action movies and all this stuff, but man, they make a lot of shit lately. They make the kind of action movies that make me not like action movies. And I really wish they got an action director who loved action movies, but I don't get that from Oliver Megaton. I get someone who gets the ideas of them. It feels like he understands action movies to a certain degree, but he doesn't have a love for them. There's not a thrilling feeling to those action sequences. I just feel like I've just been like assaulted with images until it's over. When I think of the Taken films, or I guess the Taken trilogy, I think about Death Wish and the Death Wish franchise. And the thing about Death Wish is that the Death Wish sequels were stupid. Taken should never really have a sequel. It's like Jaws or Speed. It's like a concept that you shouldn't make a sequel to, but they make a sequel to anyway. The thing about Death Wish 3 is Death Wish 3 is so ridiculous and violent and stupid that it ends up being an incredibly amazing, terrible movie. And Taken 3 didn't really know how to do that. I think that's the thing that Taken 3 and these whole Europa Corp movies really need to take advantage of, is there's a lot of directors like Justin Lin, who does the last bunch of Fast and the Furious films. Look at the guys who did The Guest, and you look at all these directors who understand how to make a violently stupid, ridiculous action movie where it doesn't make sense, but it's violent and everybody's laughing. And that's what Taken 3 should be, but instead, you have them trying to do something different, but also staying exactly the same. It's just really a collision course to terribleness, and Taken 3 doesn't seem to know how to escape it. Europa Corp and Luc Besson just don't really seem to know how to make a fun action film. With Lucy, it's like they advertise Scarlett Johansson kicking ass, and I just see her getting smarter and controlling time or something. They need to get that they're making dumb B action films, but they're not really getting into making dumb B action films. Taken was kind of the exception, but lately it just feels like they're making like really ineptly bad B action films, and not in the way that I love B action films. Taken 3 and Taken 2, directed as lifelessly as they've been directed by a terrible director who doesn't really know editing. And you have Liam Neeson, who is kind of like sleepwalking his way through these films at this point. I think in the first one he really had a point to his character. At this point, the point to his character is so silly and stupid that it's just not really that interesting. The only person in this film who really felt like they were trying at all was Forrest Whitaker. It seemed like he was actually trying to do a good performance through this movie. I don't know if you can succeed because of how terribly directed and made it is, but I feel like he at least tried. He was like the one person in this movie who actually cared. It wasn't an amazing performance, it was just like someone actually giving a shit. The Taken sequels will forever go down as another terrible franchise that's following up a movie that everyone liked. But I think the thing about the first Taken film is it's kind of a riff on the 70s revenge death wish thing, but a lot more mainstream, and no one gets raped or addicted to heroin or anything. And you know, what's the point of killing people if no one's getting raped or addicted to heroin? There's no villainy, there's no like creepy conservative Republicanness in there. They're not these uncomfortable movies. It felt like they kind of saturated and corporatized a real cold, revenge, dirty genre. None of these films does Brian Mills feel bad for his revenge or feel like, you know, killing people is wrong or have some moral complexity to it. But then it's not really going full tilt towards the B action thing where you can ignore that. So what you get is these kind of blandly mainstream big action films. Taken kind of did a good job at doing that, but it's not an exceptional revenge film. I can think of much better 70s revenge films that had fun with it and took the politics seriously and did interesting things with the character. The whole Taken franchise just really never took advantage of that. The faults of doing that kind of thing and the faults of telling the story the way they did in the first Taken film are magnified to even more extremes in the sequels because they're so poorly made and they don't exactly know what to do with a revenge film. I keep coming back to this with these films, but I think with Taken is if you had had someone who really had something to prove and do something interesting with as dumb of an idea as this is, but kind of someone who was like, oh, who gives a shit? Let's just have a ridiculous body count and have a ridiculous violent movie. But instead, it's like you get a really forgettable, boring, typical Europa Corp movie that tried to do something different and failed even more than their usual thing of just ripping off the same movie over and over again. This is both a failure of them trying to reinvent something and them continuing it at the same time and failing at both pretty horribly. These Taken films, I'm glad it ends here because frankly I can't put up with anymore. If you think this is a good revenge film, you don't know anything about revenge films, and they're made by people who don't know anything about revenge films. Revenge films, you really have to get into the deep down darkness and how revenge is cold, and Taken doesn't want to get into that because it wants you to just see Liam Neeson kick a lot of ass. And in the first one, at least, it was kind of good at that, but this film is horrible at trying to even make those kind of action sequences. This is a bad movie in so many different degrees. Morally, story-wise, editing, composition, you name it, this movie sucks at it. Taken 3 is everything you hate about Hollywood cash-in kind of filmmaking wrapped up into one big ball of total Taken bullshit. So if you have seen Taken 3 and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And this is the first 2015 movie I saw, so starting off the year right.